Mike Tyson arrived at the arena with a calm and quiet energy, the way he often did when he wasn't in the spotlight. He wasn't there to fight, speak, or promote anything. He was simply attending a major sports event as an invited VIP guest, something he had done many times before. The evening felt easy, relaxed, almost ordinary. People noticed him, of course, but he wasn't trying to make a scene. He just wanted to enjoy the night, like any other person who loved sports and loud crowds. As he walked through the private entrance, a few staff members nodded politely. Some whispered to each other, not out of fear, but out of surprise. Seeing a figure like him always created a ripple. Even so, he stayed humble. He signed a couple of programs for 2 young workers who shyly asked, and he thanked them for being there so late on the job. He didn't act like a star or someone above anyone else. He moved with a grounded attitude, hands in his pockets, mind focused on having a peaceful evening. A personal escort led him toward the VIP section. It was a row with perfect visibility, comfortable seating, polished flooring, and security nearby to keep the area organized. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a place like this, but he never treated it like a privilege he demanded. It was simply where he had been assigned. He took his seat slowly, adjusting himself, stretching his legs a little, and glancing around. He could feel the buzzing excitement of the crowd. Cameras flashed in the distance. People laughed and chatted, unaware of what was about to unfold. For a moment, he sat quietly, breathing in the atmosphere. He felt free from pressure, free from attention, free from the expectations that usually followed him everywhere. It was a moment he appreciated more than anyone realized. In his mind, he was just another fan. Nothing more. But peace doesn't always last. After only a short few minutes, he noticed a staff member walking toward him. The man was dressed in a tidy uniform and carried a clipboard pressed against his chest. His steps were small and hesitant. His expression suggested discomfort, like he was told to do something he didn't agree with. He stopped near Mike, cleared his throat softly, and tried to offer a smile, though it looked strained. Double quote, "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. Mike turned his head slowly, not irritated, just curious. He nodded politely, signaling he was listening. The staff member took a breath, as if preparing himself for something awkward. He lowered his voice, leaning slightly closer. "I'm really sorry for the inconvenience," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But there's been a request regarding your seat." A request? That alone didn't sound strange. Maybe there was some mistake with the seating chart. Maybe another guest accidentally took the wrong place. It happened at big events all the time. So Mike listened calmly, waiting for the rest of the explanation. The staff member swallowed hard and continued. "There's a guest here tonight, a very important sponsor, and well, he wants his associate to sit here. He's asked if you could switch seats with them." The words hung awkwardly in the air. Mike didn't react right away. He just looked at the man, his face still neutral. The staff member rushed to add more explanation, almost tripping over his sentences. "It's nothing personal. It's just a special favor. The guest feels this seat is better suited for his associate, and they insisted. We were told to ask you." Something about the way he said it didn't sound right. It didn't feel like a simple seating mistake. It felt more like someone had decided Mike's presence didn't matter. Someone assumed he would accept the change just because they wanted him to. Someone believed they had more importance, more power, more entitlement. Mike didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He remained seated, calm, almost still. But his silence said a lot. He was thinking, observing, absorbing the situation before reacting. He glanced over in the direction the staff member had subtly pointed earlier. A small group of well-dressed guests were gathered a few rows away. One of them, a tall man with a confident, almost smug expression, stared in Mike's direction. Next to him was a younger man who appeared to be the associate they wanted to move into Mike's seat. Neither of them smiled. They didn't act apologetic or respectful. They acted as if the seat already belonged to them. The staff member looked embarrassed. His eyes shifted helplessly, like he knew the whole thing was unfair, but didn't have the authority to challenge it. His hands trembled slightly around his clipboard. He tried to soften the request further. "There's another VIP seat nearby," he said quietly. "It's still a good seat. You wouldn't miss anything." Mike finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Why me?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. The staff member blinked, caught off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sir, the request." It was specific. "They asked that you be moved. They didn't give us a reason." Mike studied his expression. He could tell the staff member wasn't lying. He was just a messenger, someone trying to follow instructions handed down from higher authority. He wasn't the one making decisions. He was simply caught in the middle. Mike leaned back slightly, looking forward at the arena, then back at the man. His tone stayed respectful, but there was a hint of disappointment in it. "So they think I should give up my seat because someone else decided they deserve it more?" The staff member didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. The tension between them wasn't personal. It was about something deeper, something not spoken out loud, yet felt clearly. It wasn't about seating. It was about value. It was about respect. At that moment, a couple nearby guests watched. They didn't hear the full conversation, but they could sense something uncomfortable happening. One whispered to another, eyebrows raised. A ripple of confusion began to spread. Still, Mike didn't react with anger. He didn't accuse anyone or cause a scene. He simply nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the situation for what it was. He knew that sometimes people assumed things. Sometimes people acted like power gave them the right to treat others however they wanted. He had seen that kind of behavior many times in his life. "What happens if I say no?" he asked quietly. The staff member froze. His face turned pale. It was clear he hadn't prepared for that question. He fumbled for words. I don't know, sir. I was just told to ask." The request came from the event management office. They were very firm about it. Mike realized the staff member was under pressure too. He wasn't trying to insult him. He wasn't trying to disrespect him. He was just following orders. That made the situation even more disappointing. Someone higher up believed they could dictate the move without hesitation. Someone believed no one would question it. Slowly, Mike stood not aggressively, just thoughtfully. He looked around the arena again, taking in the energy, the noise, the excitement. Then he glanced back at the group who wanted his seat. The tall man smirked slightly, as if assuming the situation was already settled. As if he believed influence would win easily. Mike noticed that expression. He didn't say anything to them. He didn't acknowledge the arrogance directly. He simply turned back to the staff member and spoke calmly. "I'm going to step away for a minute," he said. The staff member nodded quickly, relieved that there was no confrontation. He stepped aside respectfully, letting Mike pass. As Mike walked away from the seat, he could feel a shift in the air. People didn't know the details, but they sensed something unusual. The arena, still loud, suddenly felt smaller around him, like a spotlight had silently followed him, even though he hadn't asked for it. He headed toward a quieter hallway near the private lounge area. His expression stayed thoughtful, almost unreadable. He wasn't storming off. He wasn't defeated. He wasn't rattled. He was simply reflecting. Something about the situation felt deeper than a seat. It felt like a moment that tested how people viewed him, not as a celebrity, but as a human being with equal dignity. He paused near a corner, folding his hands softly in front of him. His voice in his own mind was steady. He had spent years growing wiser, calmer, more patient. He understood that power didn't always show itself in loud reactions. Sometimes real strength was in silence, in observation, in choosing the right next step. Instead of reacting on impulse, he took a slow breath. There were many ways he could have handled what happened. He could have agreed quietly. He could have walked away from the event entirely. He could have challenged the decision in front of everyone. But none of those felt right. Not yet. Not before he understood the full picture. He reached into his pocket, taking out his phone. His fingers hesitated over the screen for a moment. Not because he was unsure of himself, but because he wanted to act with intention. He wasn't planning to yell or complain. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He simply wanted clarity, respect, fairness. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for one familiar name, someone connected to the event at a higher level. Someone who would understand the importance of treating every person with dignity, no matter who they were or where they sat. He found the number. His thumb hovered for a second, then pressed the call button as the phone rang. He stood quietly, eyes steady, posture calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He was simply taking a step that came from self-respect. The kind of step a person takes when they know their worth and refuse to be treated like they are less than anyone else. The arena noise echoed faintly behind him, but the moment felt focused, still, and sharp. It was the beginning. Mike Tyson's voice was calm on the phone, carrying the quiet authority that came from years of experience and understanding. He wasn't loud, he wasn't demanding, and yet every word carried weight. He explained the situation clearly, without adding anger or emotion that could cloud the facts. He described how a staff member had approached him, asked him to give up his VIP seat for another guest, and how the request felt unfair, almost disrespectful. He did not complain about anyone personally. He focused on fairness, respect, and the principle that every person deserves to be treated with dignity. As he spoke, the person on the other end listened intently. Mike didn't need to raise his voice to get attention. His calm, firm approach made the listener understand the seriousness of the situation. It wasn't just a seating request. It was a moment that revealed how certain staff members treated guests based on assumptions, preferences, or bias. He made it clear that he wasn't interested in making a spectacle, but that he expected the right thing to be done. After a few minutes, the person he was speaking to promised immediate attention. They said they would come to the arena right away to handle the situation, and that they would review what had happened. Mike ended the call, feeling satisfied that action would be taken, but he didn't assume it would be easy. He knew that some people resisted accountability, especially when they thought their authority or decisions were unquestionable. He took a deep breath and looked around the quieter hallway he had stepped into. The lights were soft, casting a warm glow. People were passing by, unaware of what was happening. Staff moved efficiently, carrying trays or clipboards, but none of them knew that a major shift was about to begin. Mike's mind was clear, thinking about the importance of staying composed. He knew from his past experiences that calmness in a tense situation often allowed truth and fairness to surface without unnecessary drama. Meanwhile, back near the VIP section, the staff member who had approached him was still there. He shifted nervously from foot to foot, glancing repeatedly at the empty seat where Mike had been. Other guests noticed his discomfort. Some wondered what was going on, but no one dared interrupt. They could feel that something unusual was unfolding, though they didn't know the details. Tyson returned to the edge of the VIP area, not yet taking his seat, but observing quietly from a respectful distance. He noticed how some of the other guests began whispering to each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. The tall man who had requested the change in seating now looked uneasy. He glanced repeatedly at the staff member, who looked even more nervous under the attention. The aura of entitlement that had been so clear before now seemed fragile. Mike didn't need to speak. His presence alone reminded everyone that respect was not negotiable. He took another slow breath and walked closer to a security officer stationed nearby. He spoke quietly but directly. "I want the situation handled fairly, without anyone getting in trouble unnecessarily. But I also want the truth known." The officer nodded, sensing that Mike wasn't creating a scene, but was serious about accountability. The officer's body language changed, and a quiet determination replaced the previous casual attitude. He understood that someone as respected as Mike Tyson wasn't asking for special treatment. He was insisting on fairness. Minutes later, a small group of executives arrived. They were brisk, professional, and clearly aware that something required their immediate attention. They had been informed of the situation by the person Mike had called. As they approached, they reviewed notes on their tablets and quietly spoke among themselves. The tension around the VIP area became noticeable. Staff who had been acting confidently now seemed cautious, unsure of how events would unfold. Mike stood to the side, observing silently. He didn't need to intervene. His role had been to report the issue and set the tone. Now, the people with authority were handling the matter. He watched as the executives approached the staff member who had made the request and began asking questions. The staff member answered as honestly as possible, his words revealing both discomfort and a lack of preparation. He hadn't anticipated a challenge, and the calm firmness of Mike's approach had set a new tone that left him feeling exposed. The executives then turned their attention to the VIP guests who had requested the seat change. They asked questions in a calm, professional manner, letting them explain the reasoning behind their request. The tall man tried to maintain confidence, but his responses seemed less certain under the scrutiny. It became clear that the request had been based more on assumptions about Mike's willingness to comply than any formal policy or genuine need. There was no real justification, only a presumption of privilege and control. Mike observed quietly. He didn't gloat or confront anyone directly. He simply allowed the truth to emerge naturally. His presence, calm yet firm, seemed to amplify the awareness of fairness in the room. Other guests began to notice the subtle shift. Whispers spread about what was happening. The arena, still full of noise and energy, had small pockets of attention focused on this human, drama unfolding in plain sight. The staff member who had initially approached. Mike now seemed relieved that the executives were asking the right questions. He realized that this was not a punishment for him personally, but an effort to address a larger issue. Mike nodded slightly to him, a gesture of reassurance. The man understood that honesty and professionalism were valued more than blind obedience or fear. Slowly, the executives made their decision. They emphasized the importance of respect for all guests, regardless of fame or status. They recognized that mistakes had been made, and they needed to correct them. Mike listened, still standing quietly, absorbing every word. He appreciated the careful and fair approach. It confirmed his belief that calmness, patience, and clarity could lead to meaningful change. Meanwhile, the tall man and his associate who had requested the seat change were now facing the consequences of their assumptions. The executive spoke clearly about expectations for future behavior. There was no shouting, no humiliation, just a firm and professional explanation that entitlement would not dictate how guests were treated. The subtle authority in the room had shifted. Respect, not power, was now the focus. Mike finally returned to his seat, but he did so slowly, making sure the staff, executives, and other guests understood that fairness had been restored. He didn't act triumphant or celebratory. He simply returned to enjoy the event, knowing that the right steps had been taken. The seat was his again, but more importantly, the principle behind it had been recognized and upheld. As he settled in, he noticed the reactions around him. Some guests looked impressed, not just by his presence, but by how he had handled the situation. They sensed the quiet dignity with which he had acted. The staff, now relieved and composed, continued their duties with renewed focus. Even the executives seemed reassured that their intervention had been effective and respectful. The crowd in the arena continued to cheer, oblivious to much of what had just transpired in the VIP section. But for those paying attention, it was a lesson in calm authority and human decency. Mike had not raised his voice or caused a scene. He had simply acted with quiet clarity, letting the situation resolve in a way that upheld respect and fairness. As the event progressed, Mike found himself reflecting on the moment. He realized that these small acts of standing up for fairness, even in subtle ways, were often more powerful than loud or dramatic gestures. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about reinforcing a principle that respect and dignity were non-negotiable. No matter the circumstances. By the time the first game ended, the VIP section had returned to normal, but the atmosphere had subtly changed. Staff and guests alike were more aware of the importance of fairness and the power of calm, measured action. Mike's quiet presence had shifted the energy in the room, and even those who hadn't witnessed the details could feel it. Throughout the rest of the evening, he stayed engaged, cheering when appropriate, nodding at impressive plays, and interacting politely with staff and other guests. He didn't need to talk about what had happened. The change had already been made, and that was enough. He understood that true impact often came without fanfare, through the simple, human act of standing firm for what was right. When the event finally ended and the crowd began to leave, Mike Tyson stood once more, reflecting on the evening. He hadn't sought attention. He hadn't demanded recognition. He had simply acted with patience, fairness, and quiet authority. And in doing so, he had ensured that respect had been restored. For himself, and for everyone involved, it was a moment that reminded him and those who noticed that dignity, calmness, and clarity could create change more effectively than anger or confrontation ever could. He left the arena with the same quiet strength he had arrived with, confident that a small act of standing up for fairness could resonate far beyond the moment it occurred. After the executives arrived and began addressing the situation, Mike Tyson remained composed, watching the scene unfold with careful attention. He didn't need to take control because he had already set the tone. Calm observation had a way of influencing events without the need for loud words or gestures. From the corner of his eye, he saw the staff member who had made the initial request breathing a little easier. Relief was subtle but clear. The man had been caught between following orders and respecting Mike. And now he realized that honesty and professionalism were valued above blind obedience. Mike knew that real change required more than quick decisions. He understood that systems, procedures, and people's assumptions needed to be challenged carefully. The executives were thorough. They asked questions methodically, making sure they understood not just what happened, but why it happened. Each word mattered, and Mike could see that the truth was emerging slowly but surely. The VIP guests who had requested the seat change were now being questioned more directly. Mike watched the tall man's confident demeanor begin to crumble. He realized that assumptions about power and influence didn't hold up under calm scrutiny. The man attempted to explain his request as if it were a minor issue, but the executives kept probing, gently insisting that reasoning alone was not enough when respect for others had been overlooked. They wanted to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Tyson noticed the subtle shifts in the room. The tall man was no longer making eye contact as confidently. The associate who had been intended to take Mike's seat seemed uneasy, perhaps sensing that this situation was larger than he had anticipated. The executives maintained a professional tone, but communicated firmly that respect and fairness were expected for everyone. The atmosphere was quiet but intense, and the focus on fairness made it clear that the rules applied equally to everyone. During this time, Mike didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to remind everyone that dignity was not optional. Occasionally, he nodded or offered a small gesture of acknowledgement, signaling that he was observing but not interfering. He allowed the truth to come out naturally, without confrontation, without aggression. That approach often revealed more about people's intentions than direct questioning could. Meanwhile, the staff who had witnessed the request and the unfolding events began to react. Some exchanged glances, realizing that accountability was being taken seriously. Others quietly reflected on their own behavior and the assumptions they might have carried. Mike's calm yet firm presence had a ripple effect that reached beyond the immediate situation. People began to reconsider how they treated guests, colleagues, and even strangers. As the executives gathered more information, it became clear that the initial request was made based on assumptions rather than policy or necessity. The staff member had followed instructions, but those instructions were influenced by a mindset that valued preference over principle. Mike had been right to step away and make the call. The problem was not just a simple seating request. It was a matter of respect and fairness. His intervention had brought the deeper issue to light. The executives decided to take action quickly. They thanked Mike for his patience and clarity, assuring him that the situation would be resolved immediately. They spoke directly to the staff involved, explaining the importance of fairness and respect in every aspect of their roles. Mike observed without interruption, noting how professionalism and clear communication could shift behavior more effectively than confrontation or anger. The tall man and his associate were also addressed. They were reminded that entitlement or assumptions of power could not dictate treatment of others. The conversation was firm but respectful, and it became evident that the executives were more focused on education and accountability than punishment. Mike felt satisfied, knowing that the approach was balanced and fair. This was not about humiliation. It was about restoring dignity and setting clear expectations. After the situation was reviewed and addressed, the executives began to make adjustments. Staff responsibilities were clarified, and procedures for handling VIP guests were reinforced. Mike continued to observe, noting how small but meaningful changes could create a safer and more respectful environment for everyone. The process was methodical, professional, and efficient, demonstrating that fairness could be implemented quickly when leadership was attentive and deliberate. Mike's mind wandered slightly as he considered how often such situations occurred without resolution. He realized that his calm approach, combined with clear communication, had created an opportunity for meaningful change. People often feared confrontation or assumed that silence meant acceptance. By standing firm quietly and making the right call, he had set an example that would likely influence behavior long after the event ended. He also thought about the staff member who had initially approached him. The man had been caught in a difficult position, following orders that didn't align with fairness or respect. Mike respected that he had acted professionally under pressure, and he hoped the man would learn from the experience. Everyone had an opportunity to grow from moments like this, and Mike understood the power of patience, observation, and quiet guidance. The executives continued their review, speaking with other staff and checking records. It became clear that there were patterns of behavior that needed correction. Mike realized that his single intervention had opened a window for broader reflection. The importance of fairness, respect, and dignity could no longer be ignored. He watched as people began to take the lesson seriously, understanding that even small decisions could impact the experience and treatment of others. After some time, the tall man approached Mike cautiously. He did not speak loudly or aggressively. Instead, he offered a brief apology. acknowledging that his request had been inappropriate and that assumptions should never replace fairness. Mike nodded slightly, accepting the acknowledgement without fanfare. He didn't need to prolong the moment or make it about confrontation. The apology was enough to demonstrate that reflection and understanding had occurred. Throughout the event, Mike continued to engage quietly with the environment. He cheered at significant moments, interacted politely with staff, and observed the crowd with interest. He maintained a balance of presence and discretion, knowing that true influence often comes from calm leadership rather than drama. People around him began to notice the subtle change in the atmosphere, sensing that fairness and respect were being prioritized. As the night progressed, the executives completed their review. They documented the situation, reinforcing procedures and expectations for the future. Staff members were briefed on the importance of treating every guest with respect, regardless of status or assumption. Mike observed quietly, feeling confident that the right message had been communicated. His decision to act calmly and thoughtfully had set the tone for an entire team, demonstrating the value of patience and composed action. By the time the main event resumed, the VIP area had returned to its usual rhythm. However, the energy was different. There was a sense of attentiveness and awareness, a subtle respect for fairness that had been reinforced. Staff moved with renewed focus, guests were treated equitably, and the atmosphere felt professional and considerate. Mike felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his intervention had contributed to that change. During the final moments of the event, he reflected on the evening's lessons. He realized that influence does not always require forceful action. Sometimes observing calmly, making thoughtful decisions, and communicating effectively can create a more lasting impact. He understood that his own response had not only addressed a specific situation, but had also provided an example for others to follow. As the crowd began to disperse, Mike stood and prepared to leave the VIP section. He exchanged a few polite words with staff and executives, acknowledging their cooperation and professionalism. No one needed to exaggerate gratitude or recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of fairness and respect was sufficient. Mike had maintained his composure throughout, reinforcing the principle that dignity is non-negotiable. Walking toward the exit, he considered the significance of subtle power. True influence, he knew, often worked silently, guiding others to make better choices without imposing dominance. Tonight had been a reminder that calm, thoughtful action could create meaningful change. He had not raised his voice, caused a scene, or demanded attention. Instead, he had observed, acted with intention, and allowed the truth to unfold naturally. The night outside the arena was calm and clear. As he stepped into the fresh air, Mike felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The seating issue was resolved, respect had been restored, and lessons about fairness and dignity had been reinforced. He knew that moments like these, small yet powerful, could have ripple effects far beyond what anyone in the arena might realize. This was more than a VIP seat. It was a statement about human decency, patience, and the importance of standing up for what is right in a composed and thoughtful way. Mike Tyson walked away, knowing that influence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, observes, and quietly sets things straight. Tonight had been such a night. Mike Tyson remained seated in the VIP section, observing the quiet order that was slowly returning to the arena. Though he had already made the call, and the executives were handling the matter, he understood that situations like this often had layers that were not immediately visible. He could sense the nervous energy lingering in the staff and among the guests who had witnessed the unusual unfolding. Calmness and patience were his allies, and he relied on them to ensure that the right lessons would be remembered long after the night ended. As the executives continued to investigate, they moved between staff members and guests, quietly gathering more context about the seating request and the underlying dynamics. Mike noticed how the staff's posture changed subtly in response to the presence of higher authority. Some seemed relieved that professionalism was being emphasized over blind obedience, while others looked tense, realizing that their actions and assumptions were now under careful review. Mike knew that the perception of fairness was just as important as actual fairness, and he could see that awareness spreading. The tall man who had requested the seat change was asked to step aside for a private discussion. Mike watched him as he spoke with one of the executives. The man's confidence had diminished, replaced with the awareness that assumptions and entitlement were not enough to override respect. The conversation was firm, but not aggressive, and the executive clearly communicated that fairness and professional behavior were expectations, not suggestions. Mike did not need to intervene. His calm presence was a silent reminder that dignity was non-negotiable. Nearby, the staff member who had approached Mike was being guided by another executive. They discussed the importance of clarity, communication, and fairness in all interactions with guests. The staff member listened carefully, nodding, understanding that while he had followed orders, the context and implications of those orders mattered. Mike's approach had created a space where the staff could learn from the experience without fear, and he quietly observed, satisfied that the process was being handled appropriately. Mike's phone had been returned to his pocket. He did not need to monitor every step. He had acted to ensure fairness and clarity, and now the process was unfolding with measured professionalism. He shifted slightly in his seat, observing the interactions around him. The executives were thorough, speaking calmly but firmly to ensure that all parties understood the importance of respect, equality, and proper conduct. The ripple effect of this attention was noticeable. Staff were more attentive. Guests were more mindful, and the atmosphere, though still buzzing with excitement, had a layer of quiet focus that had not been there before. A few minutes later, one of the executives approached Mike personally. They spoke briefly, thanking him for his patience and his calm demeanor. Mike nodded, acknowledging their words without any need for self-congratulation. For him, the evening was about more than just a single incident. It was about setting a tone for behavior, for fairness, and for accountability. He understood that quiet actions often had the most lasting impact. While this discussion was happening, the executives reviewed records of previous events and staffing decisions related to VIP seating. They wanted to ensure that this was not an isolated incident. Mike observed the thoroughness of their approach. He knew from experience that addressing a single event without understanding patterns would limit the effectiveness of any corrective action. By reviewing past behaviors and processes, the executives could implement changes that would prevent similar issues in the future. The tall man and his associate were asked to reflect on their actions. The executives explained the importance of not making assumptions about others based on appearance, status, or preconceived notions. Mike could see the weight of this realization settling in. The associate, who had previously seemed indifferent, now displayed a subtle acknowledgement that their actions had contributed to the discomfort and tension. Mike's presence had silently reinforced the message. Respect cannot be bypassed, even for someone perceived as influential or privileged. Meanwhile, staff members continued to be briefed on the proper protocol for handling VIP requests. The executives emphasized that fairness, communication, and accountability were critical. Mike listened quietly, recognizing that these guidelines were being reinforced with the same calm authority he had displayed. His intervention had not only addressed the immediate issue, but had also strengthened the foundation for professional conduct in future situations. As the arena lights dimmed slightly for the next segment of the event, Mike reflected on the evening so far. He had learned that influence does not always require force or confrontation. Sometimes, observing carefully, making thoughtful decisions, and letting truth and fairness guide actions can create profound change. His approach had allowed the executives to handle the situation effectively, without unnecessary drama, and he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that dignity had been preserved. He also considered the impact on the staff. Many had been caught between following instructions and doing what was fair. Mike understood that pressure often leads to mistakes or unthinking compliance. By remaining calm and taking deliberate action, he had created an opportunity for learning and growth. Staff were now more aware of the importance of respect, equality, and professional conduct. And Mike knew that this awareness would influence their behavior long after the event ended. The tall man, who had initially been so confident, now appeared reflective. Mike noticed how body language, subtle expressions, and tone of voice could communicate understanding without words. The man's posture suggested that he had internalized the lesson. Mike did not speak to him directly, understanding that the executive's guidance was sufficient. Sometimes, observing the change in others silently was the most powerful reinforcement of a principle. Executives continued to move discreetly throughout the VIP area, ensuring that all staff and guests were aware of the expectations. Mike observed the ripple effect. Conversations became more attentive, movements more deliberate, and awareness of fairness more prominent. He realized that a single, thoughtful intervention could influence not just immediate events, but also the culture of an environment. By addressing the situation calmly and effectively, he had helped create a more respectful atmosphere. As the main event continued, Mike engaged with the experience fully. He cheered at significant plays, exchanged polite nods with staff, and observed the crowd. He maintained a balance between presence and discretion, demonstrating that influence often works best through calm and intentional action rather than forceful expression. People around him seemed to notice the subtle change in energy, sensing that fairness and respect were now being prioritized throughout the evening. Mike continued to reflect on the importance of calm authority. He understood that standing firm in one's principles, without aggression or spectacle, often leaves a more lasting impression than any dramatic action could. The executive's careful handling of the situation, guided indirectly by his measured response, had created a visible shift in behavior and awareness. Respect had been restored, and accountability had been emphasized. The staff member who had initially approached him seemed more confident now. Mike observed subtle changes in his demeanor. There was a sense of relief, yes, but also a growing understanding of responsibility and professionalism. The lessons were being internalized quietly, without need for external pressure or confrontation. Mike recognized the power of observation, patience, and quiet guidance in fostering meaningful change. The tall man and his associate were quietly reassessing their actions. Mike noticed that even without direct confrontation, the message was clear. Entitlement and assumptions could not override fairness and respect. The executive's measured responses, combined with Mike's calm authority, had allowed the truth to emerge naturally. The lesson was being learned without humiliation or drama, which often made it more effective. As the final moments of the event approached, Mike felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The situation had been addressed with professionalism, dignity, and clarity. Staff had been guided, guests had been reminded of proper conduct, and respect had been restored. His own approach, calm, thoughtful, and patient, had influenced the outcome more than any forceful action could have. When the event ended and the crowd began to leave, Tyson stood, ready to exit the VIP section. He exchanged a few polite words with staff and executives, acknowledging their cooperation and professionalism. There was no need for fanfare or recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of fairness and respect was sufficient. He had maintained his composure throughout, reinforcing the principle that dignity and equality are not optional. As he walked toward the exit, Mike reflected on the significance of the evening. A seemingly small issue, a seating request, had revealed deeper lessons about respect, fairness, and human behavior. By acting calmly and thoughtfully, he had influenced the environment, guided staff, and ensured that dignity was preserved. The ripple effects of this quiet authority would likely extend beyond the arena, influencing behavior and attitudes for those who had witnessed the events. Outside, the air was cool and calm. Mike felt a sense of quiet accomplishment, knowing that his intervention had created meaningful change without confrontation or. The situation had reached a point where calm authority and careful attention had changed the tone of the entire VIP area. Mike Tyson remained composed, sitting back in his seat, observing the ripple effect of what had transpired. He knew that sometimes the most important moments were those that unfolded quietly but with lasting impact. Tonight had become one of those moments. What began as a small request about a seat had revealed much deeper lessons about respect, fairness, and human behavior. The executives had now begun the process of taking accountability seriously. They spoke directly with the staff members involved in making the request. They asked about the reasoning behind the actions and decisions. Staff members answered carefully, some nervously, realizing that what might have seemed like a minor choice could have a larger effect. Mike noticed subtle gestures, small movements that reflected understanding, and recognition that assumptions or convenience could not override fairness. The executives emphasized that professional conduct and respect were non-negotiable and that everyone was expected to uphold these principles at all times. One staff member who had initially approached Mike looked visibly relieved. He had been caught between following orders and acting in a way that felt right. The executives spoke with him gently but firmly, clarifying the expectations and offering guidance on how to handle similar situations in the future. Mike observed quietly, understanding that moments of teaching and guidance could leave a more lasting impact than criticism or punishment. The situation was being used as an opportunity for learning, and he appreciated that approach. Meanwhile, the tall man and his associate who had requested the seat change were called aside. They were asked to reflect on their actions, and the executives made it clear that assumptions, entitlement, or social preference were not valid reasons to impose on someone else. Mike noticed the expressions on their faces, an initial discomfort, followed by the realization that behavior had consequences. This was not about punishment alone. It was about restoring a sense of fairness and setting expectations for future conduct. As the executives continued their review, they discovered that the incident was not an isolated event. There were patterns of behavior that needed correction to prevent future problems. Mike understood that this was crucial. Addressing only the immediate issue would not be enough. By reviewing previous actions and identifying where assumptions or unfair treatment had occurred, the organization could implement meaningful change. He could see the executives taking careful notes, discussing processes, and planning interventions to strengthen fairness and professionalism across the board. Mike's mind wandered slightly as he considered the power of calm influence. He realized that the moment was more than a seating issue. It was an opportunity to reinforce principles that could affect future interactions. Staff and guests alike were learning through observation and guidance that respect and fairness were essential in every action. He also recognized that the way he had handled the situation, without anger, without confrontation, and with quiet authority, had shaped the way people responded and reflected on their behavior. The executives decided to take immediate corrective measures. They clarified responsibilities, reinforced expectations, and set a tone for how VIP requests and guest interactions should be handled moving forward. Staff members were briefed thoroughly, understanding that professionalism and respect could not be compromised. Mike observed these measures quietly, recognizing that effective leadership often works through subtle reinforcement rather than loud or aggressive action. The shift in tone was evident. Staff moved more confidently and carefully. Guests were treated more attentively, and the atmosphere felt balanced and fair as this process unfolded. Mike noticed the tall man's posture and demeanor. He seemed to have absorbed the lesson. There was a quiet reflection in his expression, a recognition that privilege or assumptions did not allow one to override fairness. Mike did not need to speak to him. Sometimes the impact of observing truth and integrity quietly can resonate more strongly than any direct confrontation. The man's acknowledgement, subtle though it was, reflected understanding. The staff who had been involved in making the request were also visibly affected by the proceedings. They seemed more attentive, aware of their responsibilities, and committed to implementing the guidance provided by the executives. Mike noted that even small gestures, a nod, a change in posture, a more attentive approach indicated the beginning of a shift in culture. The principles of fairness and respect were being reinforced not through fear, but through calm authority and thoughtful intervention. Meanwhile, the arena continued to hum with activity. Fans cheered, lights flashed, and excitement carried through the crowd. Yet within the VIP area, a quieter, more reflective energy had settled. Mike's calm presence and measured approach had influenced the behavior of both staff and guests. He understood that influence does not always manifest through loud or dramatic actions. Often, the most lasting changes occur through quiet observation, patient guidance, and principled action. As the evening progressed, the executives continued to implement changes. They documented the situation, ensuring that lessons were recorded and could guide future conduct. Policies were reinforced, and staff responsibilities were clarified. Mike watched, understanding that lasting impact required careful planning and follow-through. His intervention had opened the door for a broader reflection. But the real change depended on consistent and thoughtful action by those in leadership. The staff member who had initially approached Mike seemed increasingly confident. He moved with more assurance, guided by the clarity of expectations and the support provided by the executives. Mike recognized that this was an important part of the process. Change often begins quietly, with individuals internalizing lessons and adjusting behavior. Observing this transformation, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that the principles of fairness and respect were being reinforced. The tall man and his associate had been reminded of their responsibility to act respectfully and considerately in all interactions. Mike could see the understanding settling in. This moment had taught them that assumptions and privilege could not dictate treatment of others. The lesson had been delivered calmly, firmly, and respectfully, allowing the individuals to reflect and internalize the guidance without humiliation or unnecessary confrontation. Throughout the evening, Mike continued to engage with the event, enjoying the game, interacting politely with staff, and observing the environment. He maintained a balance of presence and discretion, demonstrating that influence often works best through thoughtful action rather than forceful expression. People around him noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere, sensing that fairness and respect were now being prioritized. By the final moments of the event, the VIP area had returned to a sense of balance. Staff and guests moved with confidence and awareness, understanding that professional conduct and respect were expected at all times. Mike felt a quiet fulfillment, recognizing that his intervention had created meaningful change without confrontation or spectacle. The principles of fairness and dignity had been reinforced, and accountability had been emphasized. When the event concluded, Mike prepared to leave the VIP section. He exchanged polite words with staff and executives, acknowledging their cooperation and professionalism. There was no need for dramatics or recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of fairness and respect was sufficient. Mike had maintained his composure throughout, reinforcing the principle that dignity and equality were not optional. The impact of his calm authority had created a ripple effect that would likely influence behavior long after the night ended Dot as he walked toward the exit. Mike reflected on the lessons of the evening. A simple seating request had revealed deeper truths about respect, fairness, and human behavior. By acting calmly, thoughtfully, and with quiet authority, he had influenced the environment, guided staff, and ensured that dignity was preserved. The ripple effects of these actions would extend beyond the VIP section, shaping attitudes and behavior for those who had witnessed the events. Outside, the air was cool and calm. Mike felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that his intervention had created meaningful change without confrontation or spectacle. The seating issue had been resolved, respect had been restored, and lessons about fairness and professionalism had been reinforced. He understood that influence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, observes, and quietly guides, leaving a lasting impact that speaks louder than words. Tonight had been such a night. The evening had drawn to a close, yet the impact of the earlier events lingered quietly in the VIP area. Mike Tyson sat in his seat, reflecting on how a simple issue had turned into a lesson in fairness, respect, and human behavior. The executives had carefully handled the situation. Staff had been guided and reinforced with clear expectations. And the guests who had made the inappropriate seating request had been reminded of their responsibilities. Mike understood that his calm and composed approach had played a crucial role in allowing all this to happen. He thought about the staff members he had interacted with earlier. They had been nervous, unsure how to handle the situation, caught between following orders and doing what felt right. By approaching the matter thoughtfully and making a discreet call to ensure accountability, Mike had created an opportunity for learning rather than confrontation. The staff now moved with more confidence and awareness, understanding that fairness and respect were not negotiable. He realized that such moments, though subtle, could influence behavior for years to come. Mike also reflected on the tall man and his associate, who had initially requested the seat change. He had observed the shift in their demeanor as the executives spoke with them. Their initial confidence and assumption of entitlement had been replaced with reflection and understanding. They now seemed aware of the importance of acting respectfully and fairly toward others, regardless of status or personal preference. Mike knew that lessons learned calmly and thoughtfully often left a stronger impression than those taught with anger or punishment. As the arena slowly emptied, the atmosphere remained subtly charged with awareness. Staff and guests alike had witnessed how fairness and calm authority could shape outcomes. Mike understood that influence does not always come from loud gestures or dramatic actions. Sometimes it comes from quiet observation, thoughtful intervention, and the simple insistence that dignity matters. He had provided an example of that approach tonight, and he could see the effect in the behaviors around him. Executives moved through the VIP area, finalizing the review of the situation. They discussed adjustments to procedures and protocols, ensuring that similar misunderstandings or assumptions would be avoided in the future. Mike listened quietly, appreciating the thoroughness of their approach. This was not about blame. It was about creating a system where fairness and respect were consistently upheld. By addressing the underlying patterns, they were ensuring that future events would reflect the values he had quietly championed. Mike's thoughts turned inward as he considered the broader lessons of the evening. Influence often manifests in subtle ways. Acting with patience, clarity, and quiet authority can create change that resonates beyond the immediate moment. By remaining composed, he had allowed the truth to surface naturally and had provided space for others to learn and adjust their behavior. The VIP area had become a microcosm for the kind of respect and dignity that should guide human interactions everywhere. The staff members who had been involved in the original seating request now approached Mike with a mix of respect and curiosity. They asked questions about his approach and how he managed to remain calm while addressing the issue. Mike spoke simply, emphasizing patience, observation, and the importance of focusing on principles rather than emotions. He explained that standing up for fairness does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires thoughtful action and letting others see the truth through guided reflection. The executives nodded in agreement with Mike's observations. They recognized that his calm intervention had made their job easier, allowing them to handle the situation effectively without escalating tension or creating unnecessary conflict. Mike's approach had reinforced the importance of professionalism and thoughtful decision-making, both for staff and guests. It had set a tone that would likely influence behavior well beyond the evening. Meanwhile, the tall man and his associate approached the staff quietly, offering apologies and acknowledging that their assumptions had been misguided. Mike observed the interaction with satisfaction. The situation had been resolved without humiliation or aggression, yet the lesson had been learned. Respect, fairness, and professional behavior had been emphasized in a manner that encouraged reflection and understanding. The quiet resolution left a lasting impression on everyone involved. As the arena lights dimmed and staff began closing sections, Mike Tyson took a moment to absorb the atmosphere. The VIP area had returned to calm order, but the subtle changes in behavior and awareness were noticeable. Staff moved with greater confidence, guests were treated with attention and care, and the executives had implemented procedures to prevent future misunderstandings. Mike recognized that the impact of his calm intervention had created a ripple effect, influencing actions and attitudes far beyond the immediate moment. He also reflected on his own approach throughout the evening. Remaining composed, thoughtful, and principled had allowed him to influence outcomes without confrontation. His actions had emphasized that dignity and respect are non-negotiable, and that fairness should guide behavior in all circumstances. Mike understood that these principles, quietly applied, often leave a deeper impact than dramatic gestures or loud confrontations. The evening had demonstrated the power of calm authority, thoughtful observation, and principled action. As the crowd continued to disperse, Mike stood and prepared to leave the VIP section. He exchanged polite words with staff and executives, acknowledging their professionalism and cooperation. There was no need for fanfare or recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of fairness and respect was sufficient. He had maintained his composure throughout, reinforcing the principle that dignity and equality were essential in all interactions. The impact of his actions would likely resonate in the VIP area and beyond, shaping attitudes and behaviors in subtle but meaningful ways. Outside, the air was cool and quiet. Mike reflected on the lessons of the evening as he walked away from the arena. A simple seating request had revealed deeper truths about human behavior, respect, and the importance of principled action. By acting calmly and thoughtfully, he had influenced staff, guided executives, and reminded guests of the importance of fairness and dignity. The ripple effects of his intervention would extend beyond the night, influencing decisions, behavior, and awareness in ways that might not be immediately visible. He considered the broader significance of calm authority. True influence does not always come from loud gestures or dramatic actions. Sometimes it comes from quiet observation, careful reflection, and principled intervention. By standing firm in what was right, without confrontation or spectacle, Mike had set an example that would likely leave a lasting impact. Staff had learned the importance of fairness, executives had reinforced procedures, and guests had been reminded of respect and consideration. All of this had occurred quietly, without drama, yet the effect was profound. As he reached his vehicle and prepared to leave the arena area, Mike felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The seating issue had been resolved, respect had been restored, and lessons about fairness, dignity, and professionalism had been reinforced. His calm intervention had created meaningful change, guiding behavior without conflict and emphasizing principles over assumptions. It was a reminder that influence, when exercised thoughtfully, can resonate far beyond the immediate moment. Tonight had been a lesson, not just for those involved in the VIP area, but for Mike himself as well. He had witnessed firsthand how patience, calm authority, and principled action could create change without confrontation. The subtle shifts in awareness, behavior, and professionalism would likely influence future events, interactions, and decisions. He had demonstrated that standing firm for what is right does not always require loud voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it is the quiet, thoughtful actions that leave the deepest impact. As he drove away from the arena, Mike reflected on the evening in silence. The night had begun as a typical VIP experience, but it had evolved into a lesson in human behavior and the importance of fairness. He understood that influence comes in many forms, and that calm authority, guided by observation and principle, can be one of the most powerful. The evening had been a quiet triumph, demonstrating that dignity, respect, and fairness can be upheld with patience and thoughtful action. Mike Tyson left the arena knowing that the ripple effect of his calm intervention would extend far beyond the VIP section. Staff, executives, and guests had all been influenced by the example he had set. Respect, fairness, and professional behavior had been reinforced, and the principles of dignity had been preserved. The night had demonstrated the power of quiet authority and principled action, leaving a lasting impression on everyone involved. It had been a lesson in human behavior, a reminder of the importance of fairness, and a demonstration of how thoughtful intervention can create meaningful change without conflict or spectacle.